Hi, this is Misha, and this is part 3 in our series, going a little more in depth into the history and looking at the development of the AK series. This part is on the AK74, AKS74, and later variations. In my hands is an Arsenal SLR 105, which is an import from about 12 years ago. It is a Bulgarian built copy of the original AK74. And this one's dressed in Russian furniture. Also on the table is a more modern arsenal. This is a Bulgarian SLR 104 FR 104-34 to be exact on the model number. This is the side folding version that was imported from about 2013 until 2016. And this is a clone of the AKS74, which is obviously the side folder. Both of these weapons are chambered for the 5.45 by 39 millimeter M74 cartridge, which in reality is a 5.6 diameter cartridge. Now in video 1 we looked at the original AK-47 prototypes and the production AKs through the Type 3, which were milled guns in 7.62-39. Video 2 we looked at the AKM and the AKMS, which were stamped receiver guns, still in 7.62-39. Now 7.62-39 was a very good cartridge for World War II, the dawn of the intermediate era. It allowed to work in a select fire weapon such as a Kalashnikov. It had decent range, penetration, so on and so forth. However, Americas began to change the game, specifically Armorlight, working in partnership with Remington. In the 1950s, the Remington 222 cartridge was improved for military use and became 223. What we know today, well, not really the same, but it evolved into 5.56 by 45 NATO. And there's been all kinds of loadings from very light bullets to quite heavy for it. The idea behind a cartridge such as the 223 was a thin, small diameter cartridge that would go out of the barrel at a very high velocity. This would give better range, a flatter shooting trajectory, so hopefully more accuracy, and hopefully better penetration on soft targets and against body armor. That was the idea. Obviously this turned into, in America, was used in the AR-15, which eventually became the M16. We have some videos on that history. But the AR-15 went into production at Colt in 1959, and the first ones went over to Vietnam around 1961, best I can recall. By 1964, American soldiers were carrying them. They became the XM16E2, and they were standardized as the M16A1 in 1967. Russia took note. The early AR-15s, XM16s, performed very well in Vietnam. The reports back were very good. The first ones were used in the hands of so-called advisors or observers that were American, and they were supposedly, the guns themselves were used by the Vietnamese, the southern Vietnamese, of course. The small bullet had good tumble. It was really, reports back said it gave good performance. It was disabling targets as intended. It was lightweight. It had better accuracy, better ability to stay on target, and more importantly, because it was lightweight with lighter recoil, you could carry more ammunition, so on and so forth. And of course, the gun themselves could be made lighter to fire it. Well, Russia, Soviet Russia, took note. In fact, they were interested in the 223 cartridge very, very early. Around 1960, they got their hands on just a couple of the original 223 rounds. They looked at them, they played with them. They did it, they kind of thought they could do. But as the M16 appeared more in Vietnam, they decided quite quickly that they wanted to have a gun in a similar caliber. What they originally did, they took the 7.62-39 cartridge, they necked it down to about a 5.6 millimeter, and these were the earliest prototypes appearing 1964, 1965, in that era, maybe a little earlier. They were promising, but there was some manufacturing difficulties, and there was some performance difficulties because of the very heavy taper and the short casing and so on and so forth. They were prototypes. They would continue to improve the design, and they would come up with a new cartridge for the new bullet, and thus was born 5.45 by 39. It seems like this version began to appear around 1966 and was in limited production by 1967, and by 1968 was in production. Now, it was in production in Russia, but it wasn't officially adopted yet. But they had, they were working out the kinks, and they were well on their way by this point. In 1966, a request went out from the Russian military, the government, to develop a new rifle system to fire the new 5.45 cartridge. There were several early contenders, several brand new designs, but it eventually boiled down to two really big contenders. The earliest trials were in 1968, and you're going to see quite a few guns that never went much of anywhere in these. We'll try to throw up some pictures. Interestingly, some of these guns use the balancing bolt or balancing recoil principle, which has more recently appeared in guns such as the AK-107 and AK-108, where as the bolt goes back, a mass goes forward to counteract the recoil and hopefully keep the muzzle down. At the same time, Izhevsk, today known as Izhmash, submitted what was essentially a rechambered AKM. They really didn't do a whole lot except that. There were a few minor things we'll see later. But this was ostensibly on paper, the team was supervised by Mikhail Kalashnikov himself. Although by this point he's about 50 and he's getting higher up, and as is famously known, he wasn't a big proponent of the small diameter. He still liked the 7.62, the 30 caliber. Remember, he fought in World War II. He had that mindset. So the actual lead designer on what became the A3 was a man by the name of Krykushkin, and he would work on it. They would have more advanced prototypes by 1970, and its most serious contender was a design known as the SA-006 by Konstantinov. It was a different design. It wasn't really based on the Kalashnikov, and these two would go head-to-head in various trials throughout the early 70s. The SA-006 proved to be basically as reliable and durable as the A3 prototype. It also proved to be more accurate with a better hit probability, maybe even a little better accuracy. However, what was going for the A3 was familiarity. About 50% of the parts, more so early on, were interchangeable with the current service AKM. Now, most of these were small pin springs, trigger groups, things like that, of course. Barrels and whatnot would not be magazines, of course. Bolt heads, no. But still, a lot of the small components that an armorer would replace were the same. And likewise, already the armorers trained on the AKM and AK in the Soviet military would be very familiar with it. Same goes with the soldiers. Familiarity. On top of all of that, The production lines were already set up for the AKM, so it wouldn't take a whole lot to retool to do the new weapon in the new caliber. In the end, they went with familiarity, which is kind of a repeat of the story with the original AKM adoption and when it replaced the AK in 1959. Sometime in early 1974, the A3 was officially adopted as the AK74, and at the same time, the 545 cartridge was officially adopted as the M74 7N6 round. It would be a steel jacketed lead bullet. It would have a hollow tip, and early on they would use mild steel. Later on they would go to more hardened steel and attempt to have better penetration on body armor and other light armor, but early on they would use a real mild steel. So both would be adopted in 1974, and they would go into production. 6 factories would produce the cartridge in Russia, and 2 main factories would produce the rifles themselves. Izhevsk, of course, because that's where the design came from, and soon Tula would follow suit, who had been making the AKM as well. So it took a couple of years to set things up, eventual testing, tinkering with the design. We'll get into some of the changes here in a little bit, but they were updating the design throughout the 70s. The first accounts that I can find, and it's a very commonly widely published account, of the AK-74 being seen in the hands of Red Army soldiers was in November of 1977 during the parade. Now, they weren't quite in combat yet. However, by 1979, probably before in small numbers, they would be deployed in Afghanistan and rapidly would become famous, even to the West. It didn't take long for the new rifle to become famous in the West. And actually there was an attempt in the movie Red Dawn to replicate the AK-74 by using its very distinctive muzzle brake. At the same time they adopted this rifle, they obviously needed a side-folding version for paratroopers and specialists, and so the AKS-74 would go into service and production a short time later. Now, so this one's more of a Bulgarian pattern. It uses this metal triangle folding stock, which somewhat uniquely folds to the left. Locking on. Like the AKMS, it leaves a very flat back here, making the weapon very compact. One interesting thing to point out, whereas the AKMS was heavier than the AKM, the AKS74 is actually lighter than the AK74. This folding stock and its hardware, because it's hollow stamped steel, made the gun lighter, which is always appreciated by airborne. It was also quite cheap to produce, and it has a lot better lockup than the underfolding stock. So in pretty much every way, it's a better stock. It's slimmer. While it doesn't have a great cheek weld, it is better than on an underfolder as well. I'm not going to go into all the production changes in this video, because if I did, it would probably be 2 hours long and we'd have to toss up 50 different photos at least, and I don't want to do that to Jay. But I wanted to mention a few that are kind of important and just kind of what stuck out to me. The earliest AK-74 started to be produced in 1973, really right before adoption. They would have a lot of AKM features. What they would have updated, though, they would go to the new pattern of 24mm threads, which are part of the sight base rather than directly on the barrel. They would have a large muzzle brake. The original ones were a single piece. What we know today is a half moon. It would be a little bit shorter, especially up here where the bayonet would fit around. we would have a bayonet lug under the sight base here. We would still have a 45-degree gas block on the early guns, and we would not have an accessory lug. Now this one, of course, is an import, so the accessory lug was machined off, but it would be kind of similar to this, actually. We would still use modified, or basically late production style, 1970s style AKM type furniture. A lot of holdover AKM parts were being used at this point. Let me put the bayonet lug on, the bayonet on. The bayonet's kind of different from the AKM because it obviously attaches to the sight base here. It allows the bayonet to protrude a little further. The bayonet had to be modified slightly to work on the AK74 style brake, but these will still fit earlier AKMs, although some earlier AKM bayonets won't fit AK74s. By 1976, limited for production, the first true batches would go in. They would do things like add an accessory lug here. They would start to use dedicated furniture. The earliest guns would have a thick rubber butt plate. Then they would go to a thin rubber butt plate, and then they would go to the metal rib style, like on this gun. And that would pretty much stick for rest of production for quite a while. They would add these lightning cuts to the buttstock. They were done to lighten it, that's for sure. They were also done for easy distinguishing from an AKM, so a double purpose there. I think they look cool. The palm swells would be similar to an AKM, but shaped a little more squared off, a little differently. They would begin to add lightning cuts to the blocks to make them a little lighter, obviously. They would change the top cover, adding this dimple here. I don't know why they added it, but I suspect to give a little more purchase on the safety. If it's stuck, you can kind of get in a little better. Of course, you have this tab down here. They would eventually go to what they call this a lazy cover, where the serrations are lighter stamped, but you get the idea. By 1979, we would go into full-scale mass production, and they would start to make them in the millions. This muzzle brake would appear, so the so-called zigzag brake. It has laser-etched zigzag cuts in it for venting gas. It's still a single, I'm just getting the bayonet up here. Okay. It's still a single piece design. You can see it's flat inside. These are chrome lined. They went to a longer ring up here for the bayonet lug. We're still using a short collar back here. Normally a gun from the late 70s would have your accessory lug. One of the biggest changes was to switch to this 90-degree gas block. The early AK74s used the AKM style 45 degree, which had the gas port coming in obviously at an angle, and this led to what is known as bullet shear. To help prevent this, with the new small diameter higher velocity cartridge, they went to a 90-degree port and thus a 90-degree block. The earliest sight blocks and gas blocks might be machined, but very soon they would go to cast. In fact, all the ones I've seen have been cast, but they were high quality military grade castings, but it's very possible that some of the early ones were still machined to some extent. Have a cooling slot handguard here. The original pattern of mags would be just like the late style AKM mag, made out of an AG4 material, commonly called Bakelite, although it's not. It's a reinforced fiberglass. It has a metal skeleton with metal tabs. 30 rounds. Dimpled magwell. They would go from the AKM style mag release to this square style with a dimple in it, sometime in the early 80s. And like I said, they would just keep making little changes. There's some very, very good parts guides out there. But the basic idea for the changes, they would get away from AKM pattern style parts and they would go to AK74 specific style parts. Now if we look at the other rifle over here, these guns are made very similar. This has one of the earlier, more polymer type mags. This one's Bulgarian Circle 21. Russia would also adopt this. These would they start to manufacture them in the early 80s, and you start to see them in the field in the mid 80s. They are a little more durable, and of course they're a more natural, more muted color than the so-called Bakelites. Russia would do these in plum of different shades. Bulgaria would do brown, kind of a sand brown almost, to a dark brown. They would do a lighter red to a darker red. There are some Bulgarian plums, but I have to wonder if they're actually not just repurposed Russians. A lot of stuff labeled made in Bulgaria here came out of Bulgaria, but it was originally from Russia. So they would go to that. This one has the accessory lug, as you can see. This was used for attaching a grenade launcher here. And I guess the idea was if you had other accessories, we could still use it. We have the same bayonet lug here. This has the 1980s style two-piece brake. This one's Bulgarian. Russia did a somewhat similar version. The Bulgarian's a little simplified. We're still using the short collar here. The baffles up here are pressed into the main body. Still chrome lined, of course. They would add these bulges here on each side of the front sight base. The reason they did that was to give extra windage adjustment, so it can be adjusted further than on an earlier AKM. And this one has the same style top cover. They would also go to a so-called flat back cocking handle, which is part of the bolt carrier. This was a little stronger and maybe a little easier to produce too. This one has the scope rail, which was an option. If the rifle had the rail, it was known as the AK, whatever, I can't remember right now, I apologize. If I say AKN74, I'll be corrected, and if I say AK74N, I'll be corrected. I want to say it's AKN74. Either way, they added an N to the designation. Someone can correct me, or I'll type it in the description when we do it. But either way, they would give the rail as an option on the AK. And this was to mostly attach a night vision scope. They were beginning to issue the night vision scopes quite a bit in the Afghan period. This one has the ribbed butt plate, which is commonly thought of as Bulgarian. There are a ton of minor variations in these metal side folding stocks. Most of the Russian ones you see will have a flat back butt plate, as you'll see on one of my later guns. This one has This one has the, I believe it's lighter wood, is it not? You guys can see it, I can't. But the lighter wood is usually identified more as Bulgarian, although the Russian wood came in a lot of different hues and colors as well. But the most of the time when people think of Russian wood, they think of the more red iodine type wood like this one. The cleaning rod would be updated a little bit too with a slimmer front end. So they kept tinkering with the designs. They would start to use more cast parts, although as I've said in every other AK video I've done, never the trunnions. The trunnions were always machined. Still using a stamped receiver that's 1.0 millimeter, which is pretty much a holdover from the AKM. They would alter the magwell dimple shapes as time would go on a little bit too. And yeah, they would just kind of keep working. So Russia adopted the AK74 in 1974 and began to field it in late 1977. Along with the 545 cartridge, it encouraged other Warsaw Pact nations to do likewise, like they had done with the AK and the AKM. The two that really took the design were East Germany, who had adopted as the MPI M74N, usually. Most of the East Germans I've seen had the rails. The East German guns were pretty much a copy of around a 1980 Russian, with the exception of the furniture. The metal, the receiver, and all this would be very, and they would use the zigzag brake on most of the ones I've seen. But they would use the pretty unique East German furniture. They would have a brown polymer upper handguard. They would have a Bakelite or AG4 style lower handguard. And they would use a crutch folding stock so they could make any gun a folder or a fixed stock, because it used the fixed stock rear trunnion as on this one. They would produce their own magazines, also made out of the AG4 material, Bakelite. And so East Germany would get in on the game. You know, I should have looked it up before starting the talk. If memory serves, it was around 1982 when the East German guns started to come out. Again, I'll put it in the description, or you guys can let me know. But early 80s. Bulgaria would first start using the AK74 around 1984. The very beginning, the very first guns would be Russian. They would just, get them off Russia. Later, they would begin assembling guns at Factory 10, what we know today as Arsenal, from Russian parts under Russian supervision. And by around 1986-87, they would be making most of their own parts, although Russian parts would continue to pop up in Bulgarian production throughout. It's kind of interesting. This gun over here again, these SLR 105s, pretty much all of them I've seen, or at least the majority, have what is called a double rivet trunnion here. It's actually the feed ramp where that's put into the trunnion, and that is a Russian trunnion from what most people agree. So these SLR 105s, which were produced around 2004 for the civilian market, were still using up some old Russian parts. From what I read, it was a batch of virgin parts from Tula that Arsenal was using up. A few other things that just kind of come to mind, it's kind of interesting. The rear trunnion originally was AKM style. Later, they would move this front rivet forward. It actually has a forked trunnion in here to make it stronger. This rivet back here is the same as on an AKM. It's a long rivet that crosses the entire receiver. Up here, we actually have two small rivets to hold the arms of the fork. This was done to make the rear stronger, and it did very well. The triggers also changed over time. The early triggers would be just like an AKM. Then they would go to a hollow back design. Then they would go to a cast design. And then they would go to basically a solid cast design. So there's a few trigger variations. On this stuff, guys, I'm doing my best. Some of these parts I've never been able to hold myself, and since I can't look at photos, if I haven't held something, I'll do my best to get an idea of it in my head, but it's kind of hard. Now, if people want to send me interesting parts, rare parts just to handle and look at, I will be more than happy to do that and send them back to you, paid postage and everything, because I love looking at these variations. That's why I picked up this SLR 105. So moving on, the modernized AK74M. This is my SGL 3194, a rifle I really enjoy pulling out and shooting any chance I get. It's definitely one of my favorite AKs. Yeah, I know it has a few things that are inconsistent with the AK74M, but man, for the few things it gets not quite right, it gets a lot right. And up until these came in, there was really nothing even close aside from a very expensive custom build. As I've said, the AK-74 saw a lot of use in Afghanistan, and the AKS-74 proved itself to be useful as well. And there was also a very short carbine version called the AKS-74U, which we often call today the Krinkov, and it will be in its own episode, so no fears, we will get to the Krinkov, but it seemed like it deserved better than just being pigeonholed in with 5 or 6 other guns. The AK74M is really a culmination of a lot of improvements and design changes, and honestly just changes to production to make it faster and easier to produce with modern tooling, that started to begin around 1985. That time, the wood furniture, which by the way, the late woods will lose their cooling slots, so if you see an AK74 without cooling slots, it probably has a late style handguard. Anyway, it would be replaced by what we call polymer furniture, and often Plum polymer. Now, Plum's a little bit of a misnomer, and it's a really interesting story, the Plum stuff. And I don't have a Plum rifle here. I do have a Plum stock set coming to me in the mail, so maybe I'll do a video on Plum, just because it is neat. They even have a Plum RPK stock set coming in addition to AK74, so maybe a little addendum there. But they switched from wood to polymer, and it's interesting because while I'm sure factory new rifles, they switched everything over at once, a lot of times as rifles would break a stock or upper handguard or whatever, they would replace it with the Plum hued polymer. Now, no one really knows for sure why Plum came to be. There's no one in Russia has said, I worked at the 86 factory, here's my credentials, this is why we did it. There have been a lot of theories as to why that color. Some of them range from it was a mistake in the production line, such as the dye didn't, they tried to dye the polymer, because the polymer would have been white and it needs to be dyed. So some say, well, the dye didn't take, and they point to some of the speckled Plum that's out there where there's little speckles of white where the pellets didn't dilute properly. Some just say, well, they thought it would make it black, it made it kind of plum, and the plum itself isn't really a purple plum from what I understand. It's more of a brownish purple that really is most apparent in direct sunlight. Some people say no, it wasn't an accident. After all, they made magazines and stocks and even bayonets in Plum, and they did all this, so it was obviously intentional. And they say it was done because of night vision, that it didn't appear on night vision optics, which are becoming very common in the 80s. Others say that it was done because Plum, or anything off from pure black, doesn't show up in nature as well. Like black stands out more in nature, true black. There's been a claim that true black doesn't exist in nature. I don't think this is true, but people say maybe Plum blended better in wider environments. Finally, some have said that the Plum was just more durable. The mixture was of that era. It's just that's what they had to do to make it a durable enough material. Already looking at the Bakelite, the AG4 material, and the brown and the red, they weren't really concerned with color coordination at the time, so it is what it is. Now, this mag in this gun is a Plum mag. This is the best I could do in short notice, so you can see it here. This is an 86 mag. So the furniture began to change. We're still producing the AK74 with a fixed stock and the AKS74 with a metal folder. As I previously alluded to, the two-piece muzzle brake would appear. Now, the early Russian two-piece would have kind of a gentle taper to it. The Bulgarian is like this one here, where it's simplified with a sharp step down and a short collar. The Russian was very similar to this, it just was a little more faceted and a little more tapered, a little more expensive to make. The Bulgarians cheapened it up a bit. Around 1990, the so-called long collar would appear. As you see, this collar stretches out further, enough that the gas ports are actually kind of on its edge. And they did this because the collar under here on the sight base was lengthened. The idea was to stabilize this better for better accuracy and just to have a tighter, snugger fitting device. Now, in production, these sight bases are still a single piece, as they always had been, with the threads as part of the base. But they did experiment in the late 80s, very early 90s with a two-piece design where the threads were pinned on as a separate unit to the barrel. I think the idea was for timing, to actually have perfectly timed devices, but they quickly dropped this because it was, not worth it. They would make several other alterations. Another one that's common were the dimple pressed devices on the barrel, such as the sight base and the gas block. Early ones, like on the AKM, were pinned on. You can see the pins here. And this is one of the criticisms of the SGL-31. If this was a true AK74M clone, these devices should be dimple pressed. They started doing dimple pressing in the early 90s, and it became standard around 94. I think they still did some pinned on devices for export guns. Dimple pressing is faster and easier to do in the factory, but if you need to pull the sight base or the gas block off to replace it or for maintenance, it makes it much more difficult because you have to drill out the dimples instead of just pressing the pins out. This is why the SGL-31 still has the pins, because when these come into the country, they don't have the lugs. So Arsenal and later FIME had to add the lugs and thus swap the blocks out. Interestingly, the early SGL-31s used a Bulgarian sight base, whereas the later ones use a Russian. And the easy way to tell, the Russians on the sight bases, they dropped much of the lightning cut. It's more smooth here and on the back as well. It's got a little divot, but most of the cutting is gone. Versus on this gun over here, where you can see it's much more shaped. They also increased the dimple for the drum. If you remember, I said earlier they added this area here for extra windage. They went ahead and extended it all the way down. I'm sure this was a manufacturing thing. Remember, we have a cast block now. The rear block here changed a little. The gas block here changed a little bit too. The magwell dimples became more rounded with less of a flat inside. The top cover went from the stamped style over here, made from thin sheet steel, to a little bit thicker, solid body. So kind of a return to the original AK Type 3 pattern, although not quite that heavy. The safety was changed a little bit. The trigger was actually moved back on what is called its pad. So the trigger was reshaped again. We're still using a cast trigger. Flipping her over. The optional scope rail on the AK74 became standard with the AK74M, and it was altered a little bit. A little clover leaf shape was put in here, a little kind of a divot dimple area here on the trigger guard mag catch housing area. A big change is this rivet right here, this flat rivet. It's a change to the trunnion and bullet guide to both simplify production. I'm going to have a hard time holding this, but you can see it sticks out right here inside. And that assists the bolt in locking and unlocking. Now, regular AK-74s have an area in the trunnion there that does the same thing. But the thing is, if it were to wear, you'd have to replace the whole trunnion. On this, if it wears, you just drill this rivet out and replace it with a new rivet. Also around 1990, 1991, true black furniture, not Plum, appears. And this actually is a different material. It's not just a different color. This is more of a nylon. It has a very kind of softly coarse texture, very matte finish, not very shiny. Worth noting, I kind of forgot to mention earlier, with the Plum furniture, of course, you would have Plum pistol grips. The earlier Plum grips would be of a shiny Plum, which is made of a different material. Later, they would go to polymer, kind of more matte Plum. And then, of course, they would replace it with this nylon style later. The biggest change is the stock. Looking from this side, it looks like a standard, pretty much polymer AK74 stock, except the sling swivel, which does rotate, was moved up here. And there's a small cutout down here. It also has a storage compartment in the trap here. It's worth noting that the early versions of the stock lacked this storage compartment, but they soon added it for the standard pellet cleaning kit. And this stock folds. It uses the same folding hardware, hinge and latch, as the AKS74, but now we have the benefits of a solid body stock, better cheek weld, able to store a cleaning kit, and just, I think, a little more aesthetically appealing. It is a little heavier than the metal stock. A very short time after they switched to this style of solid body stock, around 1992, they would increase the pivot pin here. The original ones measured 4.5 millimeters wide. The new ones measure 5.5, and this was done obviously for strength. Now, one criticism of these SGLs is they do not have the reinforcing plate above the trigger, above the pistol grip here, which would run to behind the trigger. I can show you on this other rifle, it does have it. As you see, there's a little shelf in here that the pistol grip is on, and that leads to this little bump behind the trigger here. This was done to strengthen it if it was dropped with the stock folded. So that's one of the criticisms. The real AK74M would have that. Now, to go with the new furniture, they did adopt black magazines. Now, this one is actually Polish, but it's made out of the same nylon material. I don't have a Russian black 545 mag at the moment, sorry. Bulgaria would also copy this. They would do a little circle tin down here. This one's just smooth. The Russian would have the Izhs triangle, or later Izhmash, as it became known after the fall of communism. And this would commonly be issued. They would also go to a slightly updated black pattern bayonet. Again, this one is Bulgarian, but it's made out of the same nylon material. It gives you an idea. I've had this bayonet forever. I think I bought it 13 years ago. New. It's an arsenal, but it works. And there are several other small changes and updates, and really, if you look at all the little parts on the AK74M versus the earlier AK74, AKS74, they're very different. All the little parts are just changed just a little bit in all the little ways. Most of them done to either strengthen the gun or make mass production faster and easier. These were set to go into to be adopted to officially replace the AK74 and AKS74 in 1991. However, the end of the Soviet Union and it being replaced by the Russian Federation really delayed adoption for a few years. The design, the AK74M design we know today, really didn't become finalized. What was now known at the time as Izhmash, and still is today, although it's a part of Kalashnikov concern, until about 1994. It was a transitional period. And really, if you want to go back to the early days, work on this really began around 88, 89, and was pretty well settled upon by 94. As older 545 rifles would wear out in Russia, they would replace it with this one. Like I said, it was a replacement for both. And this is still today the standard issue gun in that nation. There has been talk over the years about replacing it by other designs, such as the AN94 or the AK107 and a few others. But kind of as with the AKM and AK74 to begin with, this is a known quantity. They're set up to produce it, and the other guns just aren't that much better to warrant changing. And obviously the new Russia doesn't have as the military funding is the old Russia. I mean, the Cold War is over, so the military funding isn't there to switch rifles. So this works. You'll still see older AK74s in Russia still being used today. You'll even find a few AKMs, usually the AKMS, but you'll see more and more of these. They've been used in Chechnya quite a bit, and there's photos out there. So we've kind of gone through the Russian, and these are broad strokes. I'm trying to give you the history, but you know, we can always do more videos for more details if you guys want them. But I thought we'd bring out a few of the variants. We have videos on these, so I'm not going to harp too much on them. This is a Romanian SAR-2 converted to a PA-86. This was Romania's answer to the AK74 and the 545. And here is a Polish Tantal Wz.88 built from a kit. So it really doesn't have any other name. It's an American kit build. And this was their version in 545. As I've already said, Bulgaria and East Germany just adopted and copied the Russian design. And very few other nations really went to the 545 cartridge. Ukraine did, but they just got guns from Russia. It was not popular outside of the COM bloc. And other nations like Hungary and Yugoslavia never got around to adopting it. Finland and Egypt weren't interested. So, you know, and it was kind of getting into widespread vogue in the 80s when communism was already in trouble and about to fall apart anyway. Maybe if communism had stuck around another decade or two, we'd see more 545, but we didn't. Now, these guns are not true AK-74s. They're really AKMs. And of course, the AK-74 to some extent is a highly modified AKM itself. But Russia charged its Warsaw Pact member states fees in different ways. And so they had to pay for designs. Well, neither Romania or Poland wanted to pay for the AK-74. They already had the AKM. And they thought they could do a better job. So Romania adopted this rifle in 1986. It was designed at the Cougar Arsenal, which has gone through several name changes over the years. Romarm, Rat Mill, so on and so forth. We still have the 16-inch barrel we've been seeing on all these guns. Starting at the muzzle, we have a simplified version of the one-piece AK-74 break. However, instead of being on 24mm threads, it's on 22, and it's longer. And it's longer with the bayonet lug pushed a little bit further forward. So the bayonet sticks out just a little bit longer on the PA-86. Now this is an import, so it has a bayonet lug because the sight was replaced. The accessory lug was machined off, but it should have one. This uses the 45-degree gas block, like an AKM, or like an early AK-74, but Romania would actually go to a gas port with some bends in it. So it's not a straight diagonal gas port, it actually bends in two places. So that was their way of preventing bullet shear by kind of and directing the gas. It also makes it harder to clean. The earliest versions had a Bakelite lower with the hand grip and a Bakelite upper, or I really should say AG4. It's the same material we've been seeing all along, or very similar. But the Bakelite grip lower grip wasn't strong enough, so they went back to the wood. Now some will have a light colored wood, which is commonly thought of as a PA-86, but this is out of a kit and it's a darker one. Of course, you can stain wood. There is a little bit of difference in the way these are cut from the earlier PM63s and 65s, which are in our other episodes. The grip is a little more narrow and just a little bit different shape. Minor things, but there you go. We're still on a stamped receiver, 1.0 mil. Interesting, we have a cocking handle, which is made longer and narrower and upswept at about a 45-degree angle. That's to work with this side folding buttstock, so you can grab it with your stock folded and not worry about it. This uses the same trunnion as a fixed stock gun would. So Romania could offer the gun as fixed or folding, while the military PA-86 is pretty much always seen with a folding stock. The export version, known as the AIM-74 for the folder, or the AIM-74 for a fixed stock, is available. It's also worth noting that some of the military guns used by the Navy have more traditional AKM straight handguards with palm swells. Most of these, or at least a good chunk, would be offered with the scope rail. And they would feed from 30 round mags made of steel, which are basically just scaled down AKM mags. One other interesting feature to the PA-86 is it actually has a 4-way selector. It can do safe, single shot, 3-round burst, which is new, or full auto. So the Russian guns didn't do that, the Romanians did. So they would put these into production in the mid to late 80s, and these are still common standard issue. As you can see in the broad strokes, it is a 5.45 Kalashnikov type weapon, but it is pretty different in the details from an AK74, AKS74, AK74M, any of those. The 45-degree gas block is usually the first giveaway, but if you do have one with a muzzle brake, realize that these are 22 millimeter, not 24. Just, let you know. So there are other small differences, and again, the upswept carrier, the stock. It's worth pointing out in this video, just for completeness' sake, this is a push-button stock, which is correct for the military. They also offered a version more like the East German with a lever, and these seem to have seen very little, if any, use in Romanian military, and were just done for the AIMS series. And still in limited production today, and still very much used in Romania. There have been attempts to replace it with a 5.56 rifle, but so far none have stuck. Now this Polish Tantal, Wz.88 Tantal to be exact, we talk quite a bit about it in our Radom burial video, but really its genesis is pretty much the same. They started with the AKM, and in a way they made more radical changes than Romania did. It's still threaded 14 millimeter as on an AKM, but they moved the sight base back, threaded it here, and then the barrel sticks out to here. And this device is a flash hider, muzzle brake, and grenade launcher, and it's very secure because of how far the barrel sticks through it. This is also why the bayonet lug is further forward than even on the Romanian, so it can still fit it. But this, even though it's 14 millimeter threads, it won't take most devices because of how the barrel sticks through. The gas block is 90 degree, more like on a Russian. And we have this extension here for a clip-on bipod that they pretty much just copied off the American M16A1 used in Vietnam. The cleaning rod, interestingly, is very thin and is not interchangeable with a standard AK74 cleaning rod. We have an accessory lug here. The handguards are very different. Instead of being held on in the traditional AK manner, we have a lever here. You flip 90 degrees, pull this forward, and both just spring off. So it's almost a quick detach handguard, and they did that for using grenade launchers or just replacing handguards. The upper is made of a plastic material. The lower is AG4 Bakelite style. Receiver. Some of these would have a smooth top cover. Some would have the ribbed, as on this one. Still have a 1.0 mil receiver. This is American made for Nodex, but of course. It's the same. Have a pretty well standard rear trunnion, although they do have a pistol grip reinforcement for the stock, where this pistol grip screw also goes through part of the stock retention bracket and holds it on better. It's a almost exact copy of an East German side folder. It has the lever here, like the East German would, or the Romanian. There's small differences, but very similar style. Now, another unique feature, as with the PA-86, this also had a 4-way selector. It could do, well, I should back up, not really. It has a three-way selector on this side that can go from single to 3-round to full. So this is your fire mode as a separate control. And your safety is over here on a more traditional. So there's actually dual controls on this, which is pretty dang unique for an AK style gun. The barrel has it, of course, but then again, a barrel is just an updated Tantal, really. And it also has the retaining latch behind the dust cover for launching rifle grenades, which is pretty much exactly copied off the Polish the WZ-1960 KBG, the grenade launching one you saw in our first episode of this series. Now, the early ones used metal mags, very similar to Romanians. There are some differences, but metal mags ribbed. Then they would go to this black polymer that's very similar to the Russian nylon. Now, these guns were only produced for a few years. They were adopted in 1988. They were produced until about 1992, maybe 1991. They only made, I believe, about 25,000. Almost as soon as the armies got these in Poland, they were ready to replace them. They didn't like the 5.45 cartridge. It had been a long, drawn-out development period. They thought they could reproduce the AK74 in Poland. They hit a lot of roadblocks. They actually started work on this in the late 70s. But it wasn't until 88 it was ready to go. So various reasons, both economic, and there's also quite a bit of a protest and turmoil because of the end of communism and solidarity and all that. But yeah, you often see both of these guns called AK74s, and they're really not. They're their own critters. I love these SAR2s for being imports. They're very well done. And unfortunately, a lot of the Tantals have gotten a bad name because of all those Century Tantal sporters that had improper barrels. Yeah, I mean, there's a big thing about what happened. And some people say they used 223 barrels. Some people say no, it was a 5.45, but it was meant to be chromed, and they didn't chrome it, so it had extra space. They also used the wrong twist rate in some. They made a dog's breakfast out of it. They did better with the later Bulgarian M74s, which are similar to the Arsenals we looked at earlier, but, made here by Century. But yeah, just for completeness' sake, I wanted to visit these two. Obviously, I don't have an East German M74. There only a few kits have come in, very few barrels. They're quite expensive, and they're very, very similar to Bulgarian or Russian. It's just they don't have the same furniture. If one comes my way, I'll definitely pick it up, but I've made a few lookalikes in the past and kind of sold them on by just putting East German furniture on Bulgarian kits. But yeah, this was a look at the 5.45 and what happened with it. This gun has been out of service in Poland for a long time. Really, the only three nations still using 5.45 are Romania, Ukraine, and of course Russia. Everyone else who used it, who wasn't that many to begin with, have gone away over the years. That said, I really love this cartridge. It's a lot of fun to shoot. It's a hot little round. It's known for better accuracy, a little better range than 7.62 and they did improve it in the late 80s. They went to the 7.6M, which had the little bit harder steel in it. They've actually done quite a few different loadings in Russia over the years, but they've tried to keep the design up to date and at least make it semi-effective against body armor. And it's some success. But yeah, it's still very much, I don't see Russia getting away from the cartridge anytime soon. They may go to the AK-12, and there's also talk of the RPK-16, new guns, but they're going to keep the 5.45x39, I believe. It's their round. It keeps them separate from NATO and America and gives them something unique. Well, if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them below. I'd love to talk about AK-74s, one of my favorite guns. I've had this one since 2002. I've had this one for a few, 4 years, 5 years. The thing is the ammo. You can import it, but there's really no American manufacturers, so I tend to buy it in bulk. But if I do that, if I have enough stocked up, I really enjoy shooting these. I put quite a few rounds, several thousand, to this gun here. It's been very reliable, a lot of fun, very unique. Also, before we close out, I want to give a special thanks to Coolfire. That's his username on Gunbroker. He has been very helpful in me getting some of the right parts for a few of the guns in this video and a few of the other videos, you know, getting the right pistol grips or getting the right mags or, you know, whatever muzzle devices. More importantly, he's just been a really friendly guy, and we've had a lot of fun just, you know, talking about variations, what happened, what part went into service when, and just really just shooting the shit about AKs, which I'm always happy to meet another guy who can nerd out on all the details. So special thanks to him. Well, it's about all I've got to say today, I believe, on this subject. If you liked the video, please click like. If you haven't already subscribed and would like to, we'd really appreciate it. We appreciate every subscriber we get, every single one. We're still a growing channel and still doing this just for the love of the gun. And please tune in again next time for further episodes in this series and further episodes on all kinds of other military-style guns and me nerdily rambling on about them. We really do appreciate you tuning in. We'll catch you next time.